that you've chosen to be here with us. Our time together today is very limited. For that reason, I will do an abridged version of the land acknowledgement that we practice at Brooklyn College. We acknowledge that the land on which we gather is a traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and to recognize the hundreds of indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands throughout the generations. I also want to acknowledge and thank the Haitian Loi, l'Esprit, who open, light, and guide the way for us, and to thank our own ancestors who always stand with us. And now, please allow me to make a brief reminder of the Institute's threefold mission. We engage in the production and dissemination of research on Haitians, Haiti and its diaspora. We participate in policy analysis and engage in scholarship that seeks to respond to the cultural and socioeconomic needs of Haitians here in Haiti and beyond. We collaborate and partner with various community organizations serving the Haitian immigrant community to help them build capacity. Our final conversation for the conference is a tribute to the Haitian anthropologist Michel Wolfe-Trouillot. Rest assured, it is one of many conversations to be had about Trouillot and to be hosted by the Institute. For the dialogue this morning, we've assembled some phenomenal scholars, moderator and panelists, people who know Trouillot's work well. In fact, one of them had the privilege to study with Trouillot. But before I cede the microphone and screen to our moderator, I'd like to borrow a couple more minutes to mention why Trouillot's work is an important go-to corpus for all of us, anthropologists, historians, or people like myself who are educational scholars and so on. When we read Trouillot, it becomes evident that we must think in a cross-disciplinary fashion, that an interdisciplinary approach allows us to get a fuller account and create a fuller picture of our subject or object of study. Trouillot compels us to blow up the restraining silos of our disciplines, to disrupt the order imposed on us, to erase the margins, and to be unafraid to ask the tough questions. In fact, to always question. Because one is not a historian does not mean one cannot engage with or question historical narratives for Trouillot. A scholar must understand the significance of context or the importance of history as an essential portal to critical scholarship and storytelling. Trouillot contends, and I quote, "We are never as steeped in history as when we pretend not to be. But if we stop pretending, we may gain in understanding what we lose in false innocence," end quote. I will leave the discussion of Trouillot's work to a distinguished panel of scholars, but I would be remiss if I did end my opening remarks without mentioning the jaw-dropping New York Times article offered to us yesterday titled "The Roots of Haiti's Misery, Reparations for Enslavers." The article illustrates some of the key issues raised by Trouillot. Who has the means to produce history? What's the purpose or intent of the teller or writer of that history? Who benefits from the omissions, the silences, and obscurations of certain historical narratives? Haitians and their allies have always contested the tag phrase frequently used by many scholars in the international community, international media, US, French, and so on, that, quote, "Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere." End quote. The contestation is not because the statement is not true, but rather because it never discusses how Haiti was made poor. Yesterday's New York Times article is rather late, but we're delighted that it finally arrived. We hope that it will revive conversations about reparations to Haitians and Haitians and Haiti from Spain, France, and the United States, the big three that profited the most from the labor of the African enslaved ancestors and their descendants who've come to call Haiti home, and that continues to pillage Haiti's natural resources. Haitians are cognizant of the dangers of asking hard and uncomfortable questions. But what would be left if Haitians could not speak truth to power at this juncture? What would be left if Haitians could not use this moment to take their case to the International Tribunal to demand reparation from its former colonial occupiers that committed the most gruesome and heinous crime against humanity in the way they treated the Haitians, Taino's ancestors, enslaved African ancestors, the Haitians of today, and the Haitian nation since its birth? In the end, preventing the Haitian nation's democratic project from spiraling further down and disappearing into this inferno is not only a moral obligation for other democratic nations that claim to be friends of Haiti, Zami Pré, Zami Loin, it is a test of their commitment to sustaining democracies wherever in the world. It is a test that will unmask their hypocrisy. Without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Mamira Dougé-Prosper. Dr. Dougé-Prosper is an assistant professor of global and international studies at the University of California, Irvine. She specializes in Black social movements in the Caribbean and Latin America, and is working on a manuscript entitled Development Contested in Occupied Haiti, Social Movements and the Gangster State. Dr. Dougé-Prosper is also the international coordinator of the Pan-African Solidarity Network with Community Movement Builders. Dr. Dougé, it is our pleasure to have you with us at the Institute. The microphone and screen are both yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Surratt. This was a beautiful introduction. And I'm very excited to be here with these three panelists. These are folks whose work I know and then am very familiar with. I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Yatimar Bonilla, and actually remember meeting her when she was a graduate student and have been paying attention to her work. She is presently the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. She is also a professor in the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies at Hunter College, and in the PhD program in anthropology at the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. She is the author of Non-Sovereign Futures, French Caribbean Politics in the Wake of Disenchantment, 2015. This is a book I always assign in my Caribbean Studies classes. She is also the co-editor of Aftershocks of Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm, 2019, and a founder of the Puerto Rico Syllabus Project. Welcome, Dr. Bonilla. We also have with us my sister colleague, Natalie Frédéric Pierre, who's an assistant professor of history at her undergraduate alma mater, Howard University. Her PhD was earned from New York University after she graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in English and History. She is a political historian of the 19th century and is currently writing her first book, The Vessel of Independence Must Save Itself. Haitian State Formation from Macandal to the End of the Napoleonic Wars. My accent comes out on that word. She is a current board member of the Haitian Studies Association, and from 2011 to 2017 was board chair of the Flamboyant Haitian Literacy Project. Flamboyant is an immigrant education advocacy group serving migrant Haitian teens and their families. And I must say, Dr. Pierre's work is very exciting in terms of looking back at the revolution and exactly, right, some missing pieces that she's adding for us that I hope we get to hear about today. Our third speaker panelist is Philippe Richard, who earned a BFA in film from New York University and a PhD in cultural anthropology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, CUNY. His research focuses on the uses of race, class, and culture by Western elites in the reproduction of privilege and social inequalities. And his book, The Unexceptional Case of Haiti, Race and Class Privilege in Post-Colonial Bourgeois Society, was published by the University Press of Mississippi 2022. And I had the privilege to read the manuscript before it went into publication. So thank you again, Philippe, for trusting me with it, even though I know we haven't discussed it together. So I'm excited to hear you talk about it here today. He teaches sociology and anthropology at the College of Staten Island, CUNY, where he is also director of assessment in the Office of Student Affairs. So these are our wonderful, brilliant panelists that we're going to be hearing from today. And I don't want to belabor the introduction that was already set by Dr. Surratt about the New York Times article, but I think it is fitting for us to be here talking about Tuyo's work, who has, as Dr. Surratt said, engaged with history in ways that the New York Times is really erasing by not citing, right? Certain important scholars who have been doing this work, including, some of the folks here on this panel. And I think, I'll leave it to the panelists to discuss these different works and how they've impacted them. But I wanted to say that, one of the texts that impacts me the most and influences my work is certainly Haiti State Against Nation. As a daughter of a Cameroun, as a daughter of someone who had been imprisoned under the Duvalier regime, it was very important for me to be able to understand those times, right, in a quote unquote objective way, backed up by data. That helps me to counter, right, the arguments of many folks. And I know, Philippe, Dr. Marius, you engaged the Duvalierism in your book, right, to engage these kinds of folks who always say, right, Duvalier was doing great things for the country, right, as a Black nationalist. So just wanted to put that out there in my personal connection with Tuyo's work, in addition to all the other books that those of us who are anthropologists on the panel have had to read, The Savage Slot, etc. So I'll leave you to it. And I wanted to start out by asking you, without spending too much time on the New York Times article, but talking about Tuyo's work, right? Silencing the past, right? He's actually talking very much about this past that has been silenced, even though many people, including himself, have written about it. And now, you have the New York Times, a white supremacist newspaper, really, acting as if they've uncovered something, right, that no one else had ever been talking about. So I wanted to ask you to briefly comment on Tuyo's work, on his contribution to us thinking about the past, particularly Haiti. And in any fashion, if you want to, right, engage this New York Times article and what it might mean for us today. And we can start in alphabetical order, or if anybody wants to jump in. But I would invite Dr. Bonilla to start first, just because of alphabetical order. No other reason.
Okay, happy to do so, and lovely to be in the Zoom room with all these colleagues who I respect and admire so much. And I agree. Before we went live, Natalie was cautioning us to not let the New York Times article derail the discussion. But I do think that the way that Lily presented it in the opening remarks was very poignant, because the second part of the subtitle of Silencing the Past is Power and the Production of History, right? And I think that that's what I was thinking through as I have to admit, I have not read the whole New York Times thing cover to cover, but I skimmed it. And what was, I think for so many, like an immediate thing, it was like a roller coaster of emotion, because I opened the New York Times webpage yesterday, and yes, fantastic to open it and see the first thing you see to be a story about Haiti and about the history of Haiti too. I think for many of us scholars, we like to see academic conversations in a public forum. But then to see, the work of so many decades silenced, and to have white reporters, really taking all the credit for an investigation and a discovery, and when in fact this has been things that Haitian scholars have been writing about for decades, and pushing against the silences. So that was for me the immediate reaction. But then I guess the second thing I thought of was Tuyo did write about how academics, like, we needed to be more active in public conversations, and we couldn't let history be told by Disney theme parks or Hollywood films, etc. And that's something that I've been very interested and concerned with, and engaging with those spaces. So I think it was this roller coaster of emotion that for me at the end was a kind of a call to action, or, thinking about the duty of academics, of engaging those spaces, invading those spaces. I myself had a New York Times piece in the same Sunday paper where the Haiti piece is featured, and we need to have more of our own voices in these papers, and to invade them with our stories and our perspectives. That, the last piece that I had in the New York Times, I cited Trio in my piece about the West Side Story. So I think it's important to not just passively be upset about this, but to take it as a call to action and a call to duty. And I do take some comfort in knowing there are audiences for these stories, and that we can use this to make an argument for getting these stories that we've been working on for decades to give them a broader audience.
Thank you, Dr. Bonilla. Excellent point about how we need to cross over into the mainstream and ensure that we're controlling the narrative. Dr. Pierre, I know you're waiting on sharing your screen, so maybe we'll go over to Dr. Marius to give you some time. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think when I was in the book that Mamia alluded to, in the acknowledgement, I begun to, at some point, say the many ways that Tuyo made it possible for me to be able to read Haiti the way I did in the context of the North Atlantic. And then I said, that's too much to write. So I just dedicated the book to his memory. The first page after the front matter is In Memoriam, Michel Wolf Tuyo. It said it all. But I want to, the main things that affected me in terms of, to use Bonilla, Beckett, and Fernando's phrase, the main ways I think with Tuyo, the main axes are not unfamiliar to us, right? Maybe they're the main axis of thought people thinking with him, and that is his take on the savage, not only the savage, but the savage slot in anthropology, but also the ways in which the Caribbean and Western modernity are mutually constitutive. And of course, the power of history, the power of that the production of history entails, the power plays that produce history. And in that context, the way I can't quite not read the New York Times article without Tuyo. And as an homage to Tuyo, I wanted to tell the very same story that the Times is alluding to, the way I read it, and the way it opened up vistas for me in my own work. And because of Tuyo's urge to read the Caribbean as mutually constitutive with Western modernity, I kept looking. Anytime I'm looking at a moment of Haitian history, I kept looking to see how was that conversation going with the emergent West at the time. And in this particular case, what buried, what silenced in the Times article, and that's what silenced also in Haitian studies in general, is the fact that before the imposition of what's called the independent state on Haiti, in April of 1825, Charles Stans actually imposed on the people of France what came to be known as La Loi du Milliard, right? The law of the billion francs to the former aristocratic émigrés who had returned to France. So this what money was charged to the French treasury, meaning to the people paying taxes in France. And it was money that was $1 milliard francs that was to pay indemnity to indemnify the aristocrats who had returned to France, whose property had been confiscated and sold off. 9 days after this was done, the delegation left France for Haiti with the imposition, Charles X imposition of the 90 million, depending on who's talking, 90 million or 150 million francs to acknowledge the independence of Haiti. So to me, that in that context, it becomes a little bit different than the idea that Charles X is imposing the independence state. It is part of a moment of North Atlantic history that the young nation is facing, because what had been done to the French Republic that is now repressed is being done to Haiti as well. And to me, I think I began to realize that the tragedy is not the imposition of the independent state, but the tragedy truly is, at the time, the Haitian elites, toutes couleurs confondues, as we would say in French, all colors together, the Haitian elites presumed that they could force the Haitian agricultural workers to pay the debt. Obviously, they miscalculated. They were overly confident that they could accept the debt and force agricultural production regime that could extract enough surplus labor to repay. It did not work out that way. So to me, in addressing the debt and its damage on Haiti, we need, and I can't quite think of it without holding Haiti's elites accountable for that miscalculation, at least for the intent of having Haiti's agricultural workers effectively repay this debt. That did not happen. And this is where I also, through Trujillo, begin to be a little bit hesitant about calling for reparations without speaking to the structures of the state that were in place at the time the debt was accepted. Because it's hard for me to see how reparations money we paid to Haiti would not be spent more or less under the same pattern, in the same paradigm that the Petro-Caribbean money had been spent, and earlier monies that should have gone to the development and the making of Haiti. So I just wanted to illustrate to me how, for me personally, as a thinker, as a student of Haiti and of Western modernity in general, how Trujillo has helped me break out, and following his earlier advice of trying to leap out of Haitian exceptionalism to be able to read Haiti in the context of the broader constitution of Western modernity and where Haiti fits, which makes Haiti, to me, quite frankly, the first bourgeois republic of the Americas. And at the time that the French Republic is repressed from 1799 through the Third Republic in 1870, all during that time, Haiti truly was the only extant vision of the bourgeois principles and the bourgeois ideals that emerged in conversation between the Saint-Domingue Revolution and the French Revolution, because they were mutually constitutive. For the interest of time, I will not go more into that, but to me, that's the way I begin to understand Haiti today, by through Trujillo, to read it as a bourgeois nation state at its founding, and the miscalculation that went into the independent state. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marius. I think you've made some excellent points that I hope we can come back to and hear from the other panelists about, especially your point about reparations. But I think what comes out for me in particular is your conversation about, right, looking at Haiti not in isolation, right, but in conversation with multiple other nation state making projects at the time and even today. And I think that that's important. This is something, you know, when I am on panels with folks and they say, so what should we do, right? Even academics about Haiti, how do we stand in solidarity? And I always say to academics, like, look at your work, you know, we're using this buzzword transnationally, right? To look through not just the site, right? The local place that you're interested in, but to think about it in articulation with other systems of power, right? So thank you for those comments. Dr. Pierre, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you. So let me just begin sharing my screen. Can you all see a Toni Morrison quote?
It's blank, it's just white for me.
Okay, sharing the wrong screen. Give me one moment. After 3 years on Zoom, you would think I would have this down to an art, but unfortunately, no. Let's see.
Don't worry, I still had to ask today, how do I change my background?
Okay, do you all see a Toni Morrison quote?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Sadat. It's very exciting to be in a virtual space in a community that I grew up in. And the conference theme, I found it very interesting because it forces us to consider the spiritual and material intersections between Haiti and US African Americans. So in general, I reject the nation state borders between different American societies where Africans landed. And as I was thinking about the impact of TRIO on my work, that is one of the first fundamental silences in how I approach my work, which is this idea that Africans landing at various ports in the Americas are somehow separate from one another because of the unique exploitation they experience via first an imperial state and then a nation state. So it's Haitian Heritage Month, which is a uniquely US Haitian diaspora contribution to global Haitian history. And I wanted to think about this month as it relates to Haitians and certain events that are part of both Haitian and US African American experiences. Hold on, let me see. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this article, but the question from Toni Morrison's quote, is this progress or mere movement? So in the same month where this New York Times article is coming out, which is simultaneously silencing and advancing awareness that many US Americans frankly do not know. Most of us are educators in this room, so we know what I'm saying right now is an actual fact. People writ large are not aware of Haitian history, Black history as it relates to modern capitalism, et cetera. But as I'm reflecting on this month, I cannot erase out events of last week, which are directly connected to some of the consequences of the Haitian Revolution. This idea that Black bodies are citizens and the continuing struggle to see Black people, wherever it is that we are, from Canada all the way down to Argentina, our lives are in threat because of the inaugural sin of Haiti, namely the liberation of white assets held in Black bodies. So I just wanted to make those two connections between Haitian Heritage Month and, oh no, my slides are everywhere. Between Haitian Heritage Month and what's going on in the US right now. So in silencing the past, we have these 4 moments of silence that TRIO articulates, and it really helped me in how I approach my study of Haiti. And I wanted to bring together the Buffalo Massacre and this New York Times article and Haitian Heritage Month, because we are in a moment of fact creation, and how we narrate this moment is what becomes capital H history. So I think I just want to, for the interest of time, I'm going to stop right here. But in my work in general, I try to locate those 4 moments of silence and interrupt them historically and contemporarily. So considering the Buffalo Massacre, as we consider the liberation quest of Haitians in the 19th century, we see that by interrupting the silence, we can we can render visible the connections across African Americans that will function as a powerful antidote to contemporary discourses that seek to separate Africans, wherever it is that we are, from each other. So I'll stop there. Is my screen still shared?
No.
Okay.
We see just the lovely you. So thank you again. And I think, there are threads that we can pull through the different comments that we've heard so far, particularly this idea of that Threefold pushes us to think about, right, the Caribbean as a region, the Caribbean in relation to, as Dr. Marius was saying, the advent of Western civilization, right, Western modernity, and what does it mean to think about Haiti and in light of rejecting, right, borders and situating it within a larger regional conversation, right? So thank you, Dr. Pierre, for pushing us to think about Black lives across the Americas in this way. So my second question really is to push you guys a little further to talk about your work and how it has been influenced, shaped by Threefold, and how you've, right, either put to work his advice, right, his theoretical advice for us, or how you've extended, right, some of his work and your own production. So I would go in the same order, or we could reverse, Dr. Pierre.
Yeah, can I actually start?
Yes, we can do that. We'll go the other way. Okay,
thank you. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and my apologies, I didn't realize I turned my camera off. That was not my intent. So directly, how Trio impacts my work, I've already discussed the how silences enter the production of history. I'm a professional historian, and one of the concepts that I distill from Trio for my students is this concept that I call the archival side-eye. So we need to understand that archives were not generated with Black people in mind. So any source that is in a quote unquote respectable archive, you need to give it that little squint, that archival side-eye, in order to draw out what other historians have called reading against the grain. So specifically in my work, Trio's article, Motion in the System, Coffee Color and Slavery in the 18th Century, it really had a transformative impact in my work, because I looked at these numbers in this article and I was completely flabbergasted. How is it possible that Haiti is producing so much of the global market's coffee and sugar, and it is completely erased out of the Atlantic Revolution's subfield, which is where I anchor myself as a historian? And this article really forced me to think about the material production, because material production is not easily erased out of archives, because merchants love to complain when their things go to market and they're not being handled in the way that they feel they're supposed to be handled. So Trio's argument about interrupting the silences and these staggering statistics. So these numbers are from, the 1750s. And of course, I'm also including the Cotton Kingdom to refer to US African Americans who were producing the majority of the global economy's cotton around this, at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, to render them visible. I wanted to think about this very visual scene. If you're drinking coffee that is sweetened anywhere in the Atlantic world, if you are clothed by a cotton product, there is an African person in your sitting room. So Trio's concept of interrupting the silences and these straight statistics really made me think about material structural analysis with a human narration. So that is how Trio has impacted my work. And I will stop my screen share and hopefully you all can still see me.
We do. Thank you, Dr. Pierre. Dr. Marius, tell us more.
Yeah, one of Trio's, a phrase, I can't say one of his favorite phrases, but a phrase that he uses a lot is the guild, right? Trio is always alert to the politics of the guild, the academic guild, the production, the possibilities of producing, right? The conditions of the production of academic knowledge, of epistemologies. And to me, that has made me very aware and somehow a little bit impertinent, if I may say, as Trio was impertinent in pointing out to anthropology how it has used the savage slot. Inspired by his boldness, if you will, I've become a little bit impertinent in talking back not only to other disciplines. I don't know why one would hesitate to call Suzanne Buck-Morss a racist for deciding that the Haitian Revolution, well, I prefer to call it the Saint-Domingue Revolution, should not have founded the nation of Haiti, because now it ruins her thesis of Hegel finding his notion of universal liberty from the revolution. So, to me, that's very racist. But on the other hand, I'm also will not hesitate to point out that, and this is where I really miss having come to anthropology after Trio had already experienced the aneurysm and he had stopped working. So I could engage in when I use Trio, when I think with Trio, to critique Trio, this is when I really miss him, right? Because Trio in Silencing the Past, of course, points out that what were to become the Creoles, the Creole Alliance that were to become the founding founders of the nation state of Haiti, they fought the Bosal armies, the armies of native Africans, and defeated them first before they defeated the French. As a matter of fact, they first fought the African armies on behalf of the French expedition, then realized that they had come to restore slavery. So they broke off, they finished fighting the African armies, then they defeated the French. So Trio has that down pat, and it's inspiring. But then I wonder, why is it speaking of a Haitian revolution when the African armies had no part of creating the revolution? In fact, they were defeated by the authors of Haiti, why would one would call that a Haitian revolution? Because it's the revolution that made Haiti. But the founders defeated other Black people who presumably were not part of creating this Haiti. So to me, I'd rather talk of the Saint-Domingue Revolution so that we can remember the dissenting presence of the African armies during the fight. It was a three-way fight, right? And remembering that, then one wonders, how come it took so long? It seems to be the only one who ever pointed that out. In the Act of Independence of Haiti, the indigene is very clearly defined as those whose birth this land witnessed. And this is who is a citizen in the Haitian Act of Independence, the indigene, those who had fought the Black armies. So it seems to me the Haitian Act of Independence denied, or at least withheld citizenship from the Africans present, the native African present on the territory at the founding of the nation. And yet no one, there's a volume for 2016 devoted to the Act of Independence. And no one even began to think, what might this implication, the implication of this vocabulary be, right? So to me, Tuyo is not only useful to talk back to the West, to talk back to Western modernity and white supremacy, but also to the elites that came out of the enslaved populations, right? Because as Talal Assad speak, colonization, there was a transmutation during colonization. New subjectivities were formed, right? And not enough attention is being paid to that. Haiti's founding elites were not a white elite, but they did not behave very differently than white elites of the time. And that continues to this day. And in Haitian studies, there is no investigation of that. So to me, that is really what's driving my own work, because although I study elites to figure out from their perspective what they're doing to those below, right? So to me, it's in the code of social justice that I study elites, not that I care to know elites. I care to demystify what is happening on the ground, particularly around discourses of race deployed by elites of color, if you will. So to me, that's how Tuyo is so central to my work, to my thinking. I don't think that's ever going to change.
Thank you. I feel that I have more comments and questions for each one of you. For the interest of time, I want to make sure that Dr. Bonilla gets to talk about her work, and then perhaps in the Q&A, folks will probe you each a little more. Dr. Bonilla, please.
Oh, thank you, Mom. Yeah. So it's really hard for me to say what I've learned from Trio because it was my dissertation advisor, and I learned everything from him. I do want to point out I'm the only person here who's not a Haitianist, at least not directly, right? Although I do definitely consider myself a student of Haiti. And so part of what I learned from Trio was to think from the Caribbean outward and to really place Puerto Rico, where I'm from, in the Caribbean. And, Trio's first book, his dissertation turned book, was about Dominica. And he always talked about the importance for him of that work, of that field work period, and how it was really in Dominica that he came to understand Haiti. So for me, or to also, I think, find his voice around Haiti. But he also talked about how he undertook that work with a kind of assurance that Haiti was the work of a lifetime, but he wanted to work in Dominica for his dissertation and for this book. And so I think similarly for me, Puerto Rico is the work of a lifetime. But I, was very fortunate to be able to do my fieldwork in Guadeloupe. And I think, we need more of these cross-linguistic, conversations in the Caribbean. And I absolutely understood colonialism, imperialism, sovereignty from Guadeloupe in ways that I don't think I would have ever, been able to arrive at in Puerto Rico, because I was able to put aside, the particular trauma, that I have around my own history and my own colonial experiences, and to kind of engage in a different society. And so I think that's a big lesson. Obviously, a particular approach to anthropology and to ethnography, and to also not collapsing what anthropology and ethnography is. Trio always talks about the difference between the object of observation and the object of analysis. And so how, even as I was observing Guadeloupe, my object of analysis was much larger and encompassed the rest of the Caribbean and encompassed Puerto Rico. And lastly, I think exceptionality, and I really appreciate, Philippe, the title of your book, right? The Unexceptional, because I think that's something that I've also been thinking through in my work a lot. Trio is really, trying to think about what happens when you mark places like Haiti as exceptional, as unthinkable. And why is it better to instead make them thinkable, make them unexceptional? And so similarly, I take that lesson through my work in Puerto Rico to try to think about how Puerto Rico is in relationship with Haiti, in relationship with Guadeloupe, in relationship with the United States as well, and how Puerto Rican colonialism is unexceptional also. A lot of folks talk about Puerto Rico as the last US colony, the oldest US colony, and I try to break with those kind of frameworks and instead to think about how it's part of a larger history and system of imperialism that's directly connected to the experiences in Haiti and other places. So those are a few lessons to my great mentor.
We have about 5 minutes left before we open up to the audience. So I wanted to give anyone here on the panel a chance to add a few more comments, expand a little bit.
I wanted to add one thing. Hold on, I'm going to share my screen again. Please don't fail me now. Okay. So, to go back to this idea of how silences enter the production of history, I just wanted to lift up the people who are part of the Haitian diaspora in Brooklyn. As I was preparing for this presentation, I was looking at the first edition of Tidife Boule sou Histoire Haïti and some other books that were published by Haitian diaspora members living in New York City around the time. And I observed that most of these publications happened in buildings on Flatbush Avenue, anywhere from Avenue H all the way down to Farragut. So this is Brooklyn College Central for those of us who are not physically in New York City right now. So there is a deep legacy of Haitian knowledge production in Brooklyn, New York. And as that generation of knowledge producers transition into the ancestral realm, it's becoming increasingly urgent in my mind to capture and preserve that part of Haitian patrimony. So I just wanted to share these two grants that professional academics regularly use to protect the types of archives that they deem valuable and interesting. So the one, I don't know if you can fully see it, but the Endangered Archives program, it's a program out of the British Library in the United Kingdom. And the Public Humanities Project is a national endowment for the humanities project. And they fund these programs very well to protect the knowledge production of groups that are not traditionally in academic spaces. So before TRIO became TRIO, the Haitian American academic, he was a knowledge producer on Flatbush, literally on Flatbush. And I wanted to encourage folks in the audience to think about the repositories of knowledge that exist in a closet somewhere. I know some of you in the chat, I know these archives exist, and I really just want to encourage you all to branch out, to get into this next level of cementing the Haitian diaspora's contribution to the US. And I just wanted to have this as a final screen share as I close out. And I'm going to stop the screen share and then I'll bring it back up during the Q&A.
Thank you, Natalie, for those remarks. And I think it connects well to what Dr. Bonilla was saying at the beginning about, right, academics being part of the mainstream, being part of, you know, the community, right? So Tuyo begins that way, even if we have known him mostly as an academic, right? But that he's speaking directly to the community, he's embedded in the community, and that most of us here on this panel are also involved in community activism, right? So we take our work outside of the ivory tower, which is very important. So I look forward to reading more of you all in the mainstream, right? The next time there's a New York Times article that drops, as Dr. Bonilla said, it's going to be one of your names on it, controlling the narrative. This is your assignment, your Tuyo assignment. So I'd like to open up to the attendees to ask any questions of the panelists that's burning on in their minds. Are people going to do so in the chat? I think there were some questions earlier.
There's one in the chat and one in the Q&A.
Okay, let's start with the Q&A. To Dr. Natalie Pierre, could you please repeat the title of the text you mentioned while talking about the work of the Haitian diaspora in Brooklyn? So the text, the Tidife.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, hold please.
Published in 1977.
Yeah, so it was published in 1977, and then the orthography was updated in 2012. So it's Tidife Boule sous Histoire Haïti. And actually, it's recently been translated into English, and the English version is Stirring the Pot of Haitian History. The Tidife Boule sous Histoire Haïti, I don't think it's currently available for purchase, the Creole version, but the English version just came out and it is widely available.
Could you just type that up for us? Either
I will.
Okay, so folks can have it in writing. So the question is to panelists in general, but I believe this question fits more Dr. Marius's intervention. In the case of Haiti, as opposed to the other Black collectivities in the Americas, isn't it as well? Sorry, I gotta scroll down. Isn't it as well? I keep missing the part. A question of restitution and not just reparation, in addition to reparations. So this is the question I said we might revisit. I felt like it was what you said really needed for us to unpack a bit. So yeah, isn't it as well a question of restitution in addition to reparation?
I mean, it certainly is. I never thought of that, but once I saw it, the question from Aslan, it made sense to me, right? This is money that we actually paid, that the Haitian nation state actually paid to France. So if we're asking for it back, we're asking that it be restituted. So it is a restitution, but again, I have the same reservation that I would have the same reservation about what if we're calling it restitution as if we're calling it what do you call that, reparations. Again, it's not that. Before we even get to discuss the principle, it seems to be, to me, as they say in French, it's a fuite en avant. We're just, pushing the fundamental problem further down the road by discussing reparations and restitution without discussing what will come of these monies if they were ever paid. Never mind, can they be paid? Should they be paid? Repaid to Haiti? What would come of it, right? As someone pointed out to me, 100 years ago, there was the equivalent of Petro-Caribe scandal 100 years ago, le scandale de la, I forgot the name of it, of those people implicated in it, of 5 people implicated in it, 3 of them became president after the after the consolidation scandal, which at the time really was 100 years ago, was today what was consuming people in terms of corruption, in terms of misuse of public funds, as Petro-Caribe is consuming us for the past 10 years. But five of the people implicated, of the five people implicated 100 years ago in that scandal of consolidation became president of the country after they were known to have had something to do with usurping public funds for personal wealth. So to get away from that question and ask for reparations, to me, we are just, in a tacit way, accepting the structures of the state put in place by the founding fathers, the state as a vector of reproduction of an elite class. The Haitian state was founded and continued to be the site of a particular segment of Haiti's elites to reproduce itself, whether it was through the extraction of surplus labor when there was production in Haiti, whether it's from misuses of funds borrowed or donated or whatnot, like Petro-Caribe today, the function of the state has not changed. And we can't quite do that, again, channeling Tuyo, if we don't unsilence some of those things that in Haitian studies are silenced or are silenced in so many ways. Sometimes by talking out, by disaggregating the issues, we critique the state, we may critique the founding fathers, but we never critique them together, right? So we never return to the problem of corruption in terms of something that is foundational. So how could we not critique the state for what it is now as what it was back then? And then we're asking for restitutional reparations. So to me, we can't quite be asking for restitutional reparations without first asking what of where that money will be going to.
There's a lively discussion in the chat that I invite folks to take a look at. And, you know, Dr. Surratt, it seems that we might need a whole panel on this conversation about reparations, restitution in Haiti, because there are two different things, right? Whether we should get reparations and then who's going to control it. They are two separate issues. I think Jasmine Claude made that comment in the chat. So I invite folks to take a look at it. And I want us to veer off completely in that direction, and wanted to see if the panelists had any questions for one another or comments before we take on some more from the audience. Anything that you guys would want to speak back to each other or ask one another to deepen. I have more questions, but I wanted to give you guys a chance to speak to one another if there were any pressing remarks.
Dr. Bonilla, I was actually curious about your comment about moving away from the Cliff Notes version of Puerto Rican history, oldest colony of the US. Can you share with us what new narratives you're constructing informed by what you've learned from TRIO?
Well, part of what I've been trying to think through, and I really appreciated your comments as well, Natalie, about how to think beyond the national boundaries, right? And to try to tell these larger histories. So similarly, I've been, the work I'm doing now, if I ever get to it, is about, or, you know, if I ever am able to release it, it's about thinking about the original moment of non-incorporation for Puerto Rico, and how it was the very same Supreme Court justices that decided on Plessy versus Ferguson and on segregation and separate but equal, that decided that, you know, Puerto Rico was separate and unequal, you know, and those links, you know, I think are not thought of enough. And people, I think a lot of people in the US, they don't know how to reconcile US imperial history. I mean, talk about silence, right? So many people in the United States don't know that the United States is the US states and territories and tribal nations and associated republics, and that entire silence around colonialism and how this, the United States that was itself a post-colonial society, how it became an empire was by colonizing others, right? And that happened in direct relationship with its own internal project of internal colonialism and of subjugation of minorities within the territory. So that's one aspect in which I'm trying to thread together, bring Puerto Rican studies more in dialogue with American studies, with Native American studies, and with Black studies. That I think that there's not been enough conversation there to try to understand how our history is intertwined and not exceptional in that sense, but rather one chapter within a larger story of the United States in its transition from colony to empire.
Thank you for sharing that. It reminds me of the article, I have assigned this in all of my Caribbean studies courses, The Caribbean Region, an Open Frontier in Anthropological Theory, 2003 by Trujillo, and he talks about how essentially the academia came to be separated, right, into these different departments and disciplines right when, slavery was ending. And so to think about the work that we have to do is to rebring these disciplines that are seemingly so separate, right, back into conversation with one another, because it is doing by staying faithful to our quote unquote disciplines and to their own seminal thinkers, right? We are not doing enough of the work that Tuyo is pushing us to do, which is to think beyond borders, to think regionally, to think across time and space together in these ways that all of three of you have been telling us and pushing us to do. So thank you for your upcoming work, Dr. Bonilla. I'm not sure if there are any other questions in the chat.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask Natalie to expand a little bit more on what she was saying about how we can make connections and think about this moment of historical production related to the massacre in Buffalo, and any other thoughts she wanted to share about that.
Absolutely. So my training, though not explicitly informed by TRIO's impact on the field, is constructed as a global analysis of Black people wherever it is that we land. So though my book itself is going to be around Haitian independence and what happens after the Haitian Revolution ends, I'm always thinking about these questions hemispheric wise and increasingly including the African continent, because I think Philippe, you and I we might have a difference of interpretation of the Haitian Revolution in this sense, because I recognize that over 60% of the people who were warriors of the Haitian Revolution, they were African born. So even though they are separated from the state because of the elite capture that you described in your remarks, they are still the basis of this nation. And this idea of political nationalism emerges to create this concept of indigenousness, right? But nonetheless, when I'm thinking about making these connections across across three continents, I'm always trying to bring out the human experience of Blackness as it is caught up in structural change. So when we're thinking about the Buffalo Massacre, all of these conversations in the national discourse about an immigrant invasion, replacement, these are all human ideological responses to material changes in the structure. And this is one of the things that TRIO's work really forces scholars to think about. So human behavior is not quote unquote reactional, it's in response to very material things. So when I'm thinking about Haitian people in the US, I'm also thinking about national narratives that attempt to push Haitians out of the conversation. So I know we only have 3 minutes left, but everyone in this audience is very aware at the growing nativist American descendants of slaves movement, right? So one of the ways that I think about that is by making these connections between Black immigrant experiences and US Black realities. So Buffalo, New York, it's right up the proverbial street for people living in Brooklyn, New York. And it would be a mistake, as previous generations of Haitian immigrants made, as it related to what's happening to US Black Americans. And this is one way that I attempt to bring these various threads of the African diaspora together at all times and I think this is me trying to silence a negative discourse, which is Black immigrants are somehow not part of the US Black experience. History demonstrates otherwise, and the way that I narrate Haitian heritage, US history, I try to make those connections all the time in order to put a wet blanket across discourses that might separate us rather than uniting us.
Now, I know that we don't have a lot of time, but I would like Dr. Pierre, since you said, you know, you have a different interpretation of this this revolutionary moment and the history of the land we call Haiti. So if we could potentially take a couple minutes to unpack the different positions that you have on this, and then we could conclude. I don't know if Dr. Surratt would allow us a couple more minutes, because I'm interested in hearing it. So
it's more about your audience. But yes, let's keep talking.
Can I? Yeah. Yeah. I'll try to do this in a minute, 2 minutes. It may be hard, but let me try to clarify some of the thoughts, because right now there is a certain degree of silencing going on, right? Including what I left out in the interest of time. And there are a couple of comments broadly in the chats that relates to, we don't need to be talking, we should not be having to talk to friends about how the money will be spent. Or this is not at all what we're talking about. We're talking about the way the position, so it's a question of positionality, right? When we talk of the alliance of the founding founders that founded the nation state of Haiti, we are talking about variously creolized people, including the enslaved children of African who were born in slavery because they were born on the colony, as Jean Casimir made very clear. They had a certain degree of acquaintance with Christendom, they were Latinized to various degrees. And we should not underestimate the fact that the founding founders were all Creoles, and they made war on the native Africans, because at least I posit that the descendant social formations are today the bilingual Haitians, and the social formations that are descendants of the African populations from whom citizenship was withheld are the monolingual Creole-speaking Haitians. And I don't think we even need statistics if we've been to Haiti on the ground to know who bear the brunt of misery in Haiti. The brunt of poverty in Haiti is borne by those who are monolingual Haitian, Creole-speaking Haitians. These are the descendants, to me, from a social-political perspective, these are the descendant formations of the Bosal who were defeated by the Creole Alliance, right? And
I don't think you're going to have time to really
okay. Yeah. So this is what I'm relating to. And in terms of what's going on in the US, right, as a parallel, to the way it will help me think not only Haiti, but also thinking what's going on elsewhere in the modern West. Michelle Alexander speaks of a new Jim Crow, right? The devastation of Black communities. It was happening in parallel with the first Black president, and not enough people is paying attention to that. And it turned out in 2017, James Forman, the legal scholar at Harvard and won the Pulitzer Prize in 2017, he pointed out that the crisis of mass incarceration of Black people started with the first wave of Black mayors and Black chief of police in major American cities as an outcome of the civil rights movement. So we can't really go on talking about us as Blacks and not be aware that we are part of a Black elite. And we're taking it upon ourselves to talk about Black people who don't share our capacities to the way we imagine the world, right? That's the case in Haiti, and that's the case here. And to me, the political ramifications are fairly obvious, both in the US, first Black president, the new Jim Crow, and in Haiti with what's going on now and what was going on at the time of the founding of the nation.
Dr. Duge-Prosper, could we agree among ourselves and also the people who are there, because we're 3 minutes, 4 minutes over time, if they want to stay around until 12:30 and then we call it quits, we say goodbye, because I'd like 1 minute just to wrap up those 3 days myself, not a very long time.
Yes, yes.
There's a lot of issues, a lot of things have been raised. Obviously, I'd like to write you, but guys, say thank you for your participation, but also ask you to hold November in your calendar for us. Because when we return, the Haitian Studies Institute, if I'm still there, and I hope to be the director by then, we will revisit Vertier. And I think Vertier is an important space for us to go back, because there are tools there, there are ideas there, there are things that we've left on the battlefield that we can recuperate to really start to re-envision and recreate and rebuild this nation. So I'd like to bring all of you on this panel back around November, where we can even use Trouillot as a guide in terms of revisiting the space of Vertier and the Haitian Revolution itself.
Dr. Sarah, how do we ensure that you will be the, I mean, you know, how do we facilitate that?
I'm claiming it. I have a ball during that year, and I'm claiming it, and I'm looking forward to enlarging the staff so we can do more of this.
Great.
Yeah. So we agreed to 10 more minutes, and we give the floor to Yarimar and Natalie for their last word. Philippe doesn't get to talk again, Dr.
Yes.
Agreed.
Yes. Yeah. So please,
Yarimar, go for it.
I don't really have much else to say except to thank everyone and to also say to Lily how important the work that you're doing is, and in the spirit of Trouillot, who, you know, was a scholar, was a public intellectual, but he also was an administrator. That's not talked about enough, that he ran, you know, the program at Hopkins for so many years, and that is part of his legacy and part of the important work that we do as scholars. So to recognize the work that you're doing right now as important scholarly work, I just wanted to take a moment to do that in the spirit of Trouillot.
Natalie?
I just want to share that collage one more time, and that will be my close, because I never had the wait. Can you all see the collage?
We're seeing the New York Times article.
Nope, that's definitely not what I want to share. Hold on, let's do this again. Do you all see the collage?
We do now.
Okay, so this collage.
Thank you for sharing that.
No, it was a collage shared shortly after Trouillot's transition in 2012. I became aware of it in 2013, and I just wanted to center our sight on this scholar being human, being with his family, being joyous. I particularly love the picture with the children near the mailbox, because that looks like Eastern Parkway to me. And for all of the Haitian Americans in the audience, you recognize the uniform of the children. I just always want us to remember this side of Trio as he advanced. With Dr. Bonilla's edited collection, he is definitely now, if not before, part of the American canon. But I also want us to remember this trio, even if we did not have the privilege of knowing him.
Thank you so much. This is perfect ending.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I wanted to thank Dr. Surratt for inviting me to moderate this panel. And I look forward to being in conversation with these folks again in November or any other time, really.
Absolutely.
And so I cede the mic to you, Dr. Surratt, to conclude.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mamira Douge Prosper, an important person who's pushing Haitian studies. You all are. Nathalie Frédéric Pierre, Philippe Richard Marius are shedding lights on new spaces for us to see Haitian studies, to see the Haitian revolution, the evolution of the Haitian society. I'm very, very thankful for the participation of Dr. Yadimar Bonilla, the director of Centro, a student of Thurio, one of the major and important anthropological scholars with the CUNY system. I want to thank you all. I would be remiss if I don't quickly say thank you to the Africana Studies Department at Brooklyn College, where I teach the Haitian Times, and the Haiti Cultural Exchange, who said they wanted to support this event. And we could not have realized these 3 days of conversation that has really, done what Rio would like us to do, really stirring the pot, disturbing the waters, without the work of Prudence Cumberbatch at the very beginning, although she had to step back. Margaret Alexandre, Vermonja Alston, Aslan Charles, the father of this conference, and I'm the mother, Margaret Cox, my colleague and friend at Savannah State University, Gérard Danton Magloire in France. We met for over a year every Sunday at 11 o'clock, and sometimes for hour, 2 hours. My friend and colleague Paul Fadoul, Cynthia Hamilton, Jaira Placide, who came in and take the lead and really took us to the finish line. I am very, very thankful for the conversations that we've had over the past 3 days, because they've not only raised awareness among all of us, scholars in the public, about those encounters between Haitian and African Americans, but I do hope they will encourage us to work together collaboratively and to uncover more things in the future. With that, it's 12:25. I want to say thank you again to all of you, and know that this conference on the state of Haitian studies will happen every May. We'll have other topics, we'll visit other spaces, but that May conference will return next year, and we'll explore other encounters, other relations, other intersections where Haiti interacts or interfaces with other collectivities, Black and non-Black in the world. So with that, I want to say, un gros chapeau bas, merci en pile. It was a lot of work, but what a way to conclude those 3 days. Phenomenal, scholars from the beginning. On Friday, we open up with a bang with Natasha Bookshire, who's still in the audience. So many, Shana Jean-Baptiste, who looked at Langston Hughes in Haiti and brought new things to the conversations. And yesterday, the group in Canada who are questioning, where are we with Black studies? We think that Canada is a safe haven for Blacks. That's the story we've been told. Follow the drinking gourd and you get to Canada and you're free. And we are silenced, marginalized in Canada. There is really, they're asking for Black studies in Canada. So it's been a phenomenal 3 days of conversations and dialogues that I cannot wait to continue, because I think the idea of looking at things once and then moving away is not the way to build. We build when you continue, you revisit things, you maintain things, you sustain things. And I hope that the HSI will be the space where we sustain, we keep these conversations going, because we know those conversations will contribute to the world that we all dream of, a world of equality, a world where we all have our place, our voices are heard, and we are, our presence, where we are made visible. With that, I'll say goodbye and thank you. And I'll see you at the other end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.